Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the Christianization of Rus. And this is extremely important for understanding not only the history of Russia, but also many aspects of modern Russian history and culture and national mindset. Now, one of the key things to understand here is that Christianity came to Rus as the decision from above. In other words, the ruling prince decided that the people of Rus were going to become Christians, and more specifically, part of the Greek Orthodox tradition that later developed into the Russian Orthodox Church traditions. The idea behind this decision was actually somewhat similar to the logic behind the invitation of Rurik and the Norman theory that we discussed in our previous video. So the goal, again, was to unite people under a single authority. And this idea, actually, the idea of uniting people around one central ruler, one central person, will continue throughout Russian history for centuries. We will see it during the Tsarist period, during the Russian Empire, and to be honest, even into the modern times as well. Now, one of the major steps towards creating that unity was establishing a common religion. From what we know, Prince Vladimir officially adopted Christianity in 988. But the process, of course, the process itself, of course, was more complicated than just like a single decision made overnight. There had already been earlier attempts to do this before Vladimir, and the year 988 simply marks the point when the process was finalized. Now, what is especially important here is that Christianization was not primarily a religious decision or a decision about religion. Now, there is a myth that is widely known and circulated that Vladimir chose this religion because it allowed drinking and because the churches looked so beautiful. I think the beauty of churches probably played a role, and drinking not so much. Because I know drinking is sometimes associated with Russian culture, but back then it did not play a big role for people. So people in Old Rus, in Old Russia, were not heavy drinkers according to many historical accounts. So it's just a myth. And the truth is that Christianization of Russia was largely a geopolitical decision. If you think about that time, Europe and the surrounding regions were constantly competing for territory, for alliances, and for the influence. Now, Rus, or Old Russia, was geographically somewhat on the outskirts of these major political centers, so it really needed strong allies. And back then, one of the main ways political alliances were built was through dynastic marriages. But for those marriages and alliances to work, it helped to share the same religion. That's why it was a geopolitical decision. So, and this is one of the reasons why Vladimir chose Christianity, specifically Byzantine Greek Orthodoxy, to be connected to the Byzantine Empire. Empire is the key word here. Now, when later the Byzantine Empire ceased to exist, Moscow self-proclaimed itself the Third Rome to underscore this kind of like inherited connection to that empire. So again, I'm gonna say it again. It's important to remember that this decision was made from top down. Practically overnight, people were told, by the way, you're Christians now. And the connection between church and state that emerged from this moment would remain incredibly important and strong throughout Russian history. In my classes, I usually show it like that: state, church, together. I don't know if it messed up the sound, hope not. Okay, for centuries, the church often functioned as a supporter of political authority and monarchy. So the major exception was, of course, the Soviet period, and in later videos we will discuss why the communists opposed religion so strongly. And of course, part of it was ideological and connected to their beliefs in materialism, and atheism. But that hostility towards religion was definitely intensified because church, the Russian Orthodox Church, historically had been so closely tied to the monarchy and the state power. But as I said, we'll return to this later. Right now, the most important point to remember is that Christianization of Rus was largely a geopolitical or political decision imposed from above. Religion did not gradually spread in Russia from the population upward. Instead, the state introduced it as a part of a broader project of unification and centralization. Again, we'll see these trends throughout the Russian history many times. Now, the question is, so what did they actually convert to Christianity from? Before Christianity, the dominant belief system in Rus was paganism. And paganism involved beliefs in forces of nature. Paganism had gods that were connected to nature, a bunch of spirits like spirit of the forest, spirit of the house, spirit of the river, and many others. And, various supernatural beings associated with the land and with the nature and the forces of nature. Now, here one question I always ask my students: how do you think common people, ordinary people, felt about this change? And once again, we return to the question we will be asking throughout many of these lectures about history. Was life becoming better or worse in terms of freedom and liberties? And usually my students answer here that life probably became worse because people had a new religion imposed on them. And to some extent, it's definitely true. Suddenly, people were expected to abandon beliefs that they and their ancestors had followed for generations. But remember, when we talk about good life, we talk about freedoms and liberties. So in that regard, life was still relatively free compared to later periods of Russian history. People still had significant personal liberties in terms of travel and kind of like their daily life activities. Now, what began to change was that communities became more settled and more organized around churches, and churches stayed close to the princes. So churches started appearing throughout the region, and settlements increasingly formed around them. Society became more structured and easier for political authorities to control. So in other words, the broader process of unifying and centralizing Rus was beginning to take shape. Now, and of course, at the same time, my students are absolutely right that people were not happy about this forced introduction of Christianity. And it actually had another interesting long-term effect. Now, I also ask my students, imagine if someone suddenly told you that starting tomorrow you no longer believe in your old religion and traditions, but in something completely new. So then my students say, and ask them, what would you do? And they say, well, we will still practice that religion. And that's exactly what happened. Most people would naturally continue holding on to many of their earlier beliefs and customs. And over time, those pagan beliefs did not disappear completely. Instead, they kind of gradually transformed into folklore, folk traditions, and superstitions. Now, if you've ever met a Russian person, you will agree that they're very superstitious. And Russian people themselves might not think so, but when you look at them from kind of like an outsider perspective, you can say, oh yeah, they're totally very superstitious. And Russian culture remains quite superstitious even today. And many of those traditions can be traced back to this blending of Christianity with older pagan beliefs when people were trying to kind of like keep their old religion going while they were trying to adapt to this kind of like new order. Okay, we'll stop right here. And next time we'll talk about the Tatar-Mongol invasion, which became one of the major turning points in Russian history. Thank you.